Which wife left first of awakening. There comes a time in the inner journey when life no longer responds in the way it once did. The things that used to inspire, motivate, or comfort begin to lose their flavor. Success feels hollow, pleasure feels temporary, and even spiritual ideas that once brought hope seem distant and dry. This stage is often misunderstood as depression, failure, or loss of purpose, but in truth it is something far more sacred. It is the desert stage of awakening, the place where the soul is gently but firmly withdrawn from reliance on the outer world. In this stage, meaning collapses not because life has become meaningless, but because meaning can no longer be borrowed from forms. The mind searches for explanations, methods, or new beliefs to escape the emptiness, yet nothing satisfies. This is not punishment, and it is not a mistake. It is a divine economy at work, removing what can no longer serve so that consciousness may learn to stand without support. When the outer wells dry up, the soul is compelled to discover a deeper source. The desert is a place of silence. There are fewer emotional highs, fewer dramatic experiences, fewer answers. Prayer may feel unanswered, meditation may feel empty, and guidance may seem absent. Yet it is precisely here that something essential is happening. The constant noise of seeking is being quieted. The habit of reaching outward is being dissolved. In the absence of stimulation, awareness begins to rest in itself, not as an idea, but as a living presence. This emptiness feels uncomfortable because the personal sense of self is losing its familiar ground. Identities built on achievement, relationships, roles, and even spiritual progress begin to fade. The mind resists this loss and calls it emptiness. But what is truly empty is the false structure that once claimed to be you. As it loosens, there is a sense of being no one, nowhere, with nothing to hold on to. Yet within this nothingness is a subtle peace, often unnoticed at first, because it does not excite or impress. The desert stage teaches surrender not as an action, but as a state of being. Effort falls away because there is nothing left to fix or improve. The soul learns to wait without expectation, to be still without demand. This waiting is not passive, it is deeply alive. It is a listening without words, an openness without direction. In this quietude, something begins to reveal itself not as a thought or emotion, but as an undeniable sense of presence that does not come and go. What once felt like emptiness gradually reveals itself as spaciousness. The absence of old desires makes room for a gentler joy, one that does not depend on circumstances. Life may still appear ordinary, even barren on the surface, but inwardly there is a growing stability, a silent assurance that does not need explanation. The desert has done its work. It has removed the illusions of fulfillment so that true fulfillment may be known. The desert stage does not last forever, but it leaves a permanent mark. Once the soul has tasted this inner stillness, it can never again be fully satisfied with substitutes. Life continues, responsibilities remain, but they are met from a different place. The emptiness that once frightened now serves as a doorway, a reminder that true life is not found in accumulation, but in the quiet depth of being itself. The feeling of inner emptiness is often judged as something gone wrong, as though life has failed to deliver what it promised. Yet this emptiness is not a sign of collapse but of preparation. When the familiar sources of satisfaction no longer provide nourishment, it reveals that consciousness has outgrown the level at which it once lived. The soul begins to withdraw energy from external forms because it is ready to know itself beyond them. What feels like a void is actually a clearing, an inner space being made available for a deeper awareness to emerge. The mind resists this phase because it has been trained to equate fullness with activity, meaning, and achievement, but awakening requires a different kind of fullness, one that cannot be manufactured or possessed. This emptiness dismantles dependence on outcomes, recognition, and emotional reassurance. The structures that once defined identity begin to lose their authority, and the sense of self feels thin and uncertain. The ego interprets this as loss because it thrives on definition and certainty, but the soul experiences it as release. Old motivations fall away not because life has become dull, but because they are no longer true. Desire weakens, ambition softens, and even spiritual striving loses its urgency. What remains is a quiet sensitivity, often misunderstood as apathy, but in reality it is awareness disengaging from false supports. In this clearing process, nothing new is immediately offered to replace what has been taken away. This is intentional. If new meanings were supplied too quickly, the mind would simply build another structure to lean on. The emptiness forces a pause, a waiting without answers, where consciousness learns to exist without labels or expectations. It is here that humility is born, not as self-judgment, but as the recognition that life is not controlled by personal effort. As the inner landscape becomes bare, perception sharpens. Small moments carry a subtle depth, silence becomes tangible, and stillness begins to feel alive rather than empty. The soul is learning to rest in being rather than becoming, to sense life directly rather than interpret it. What was once experienced as lack slowly reveals itself as freedom from unnecessary weight, freedom from borrowed meaning, freedom from the constant need to be fulfilled by something outside itself. The desert stage reveals itself most clearly through the gradual stripping away of identities and supports that once gave life a sense of direction and security. Roles that felt essential, such as being successful, needed, admired, or even spiritually advanced, begin to lose their emotional charge. This does not happen suddenly but quietly, as though life itself is loosening its grip on what once seemed important. The individual may still perform the same actions outwardly, yet inwardly there is a growing distance, a sense that none of these roles define the true self anymore. This stripping can feel unsettling because identity has long been tied to outer conditions, and without them the question arises of who one is when nothing is being affirmed. Dependence on circumstances slowly dissolves during this stage. Approval no longer satisfies in the same way. Achievements no longer provide lasting reassurance, and even relationships may feel unable to fill the inner space. The mind searches for replacements, new goals or beliefs to restore the old sense of solidity, but nothing fully works. This failure is purposeful. Life is withdrawing the habit of leaning outward so awareness can discover an inner ground that does not shift with events. What appears as loss is actually a reorientation away from conditions and toward essence. As outer reference points fade, the desert exposes how much energy was invested in maintaining a sense of self through comparison, expectation, and control. Without these familiar anchors, there is a feeling of standing alone in a vast inner landscape. This solitude is not emotional isolation but existential simplicity. The soul is being trained to stand without props, to remain present without needing confirmation. In this nakedness, dependence transforms into trust, not trust in outcomes, but trust in the silent intelligence of life itself. This stripping process is often misunderstood as detachment from life, but it is detachment from illusion. Life is not abandoned, it is met more honestly. Actions continue, responsibilities remain, yet they are no longer used to define worth or purpose. The heart becomes lighter as it releases the burden of proving, fixing, or becoming something. In the absence of outer dependence, a quiet strength develops, one that does not demand security because it is rooted beyond conditions, grounded in a presence that remains untouched whether the outer world gives or withholds. When the familiar sources of guidance fall silent, the desert stage introduces a different kind of learning, one that does not arrive through words, teachings, or explanations. The absence of clear direction can feel disorienting because the mind is accustomed to being led by concepts, methods, and promises of progress. In this phase, answers no longer come in recognizable forms. Prayers seem to echo in empty space, reflections offer no conclusions, and spiritual ideas that once felt alive appear distant. Yet this silence is not neglect, it is instruction of a subtler order. Silence becomes the teacher by removing the noise that once dominated attention. Without constant input, awareness begins to notice what remains when nothing is being said or sought. Stillness, at first uncomfortable, gradually reveals a quiet vitality. It is not dramatic or emotional, which is why it is often overlooked. The mind expects insight to arrive as thought or revelation, but the learning here occurs beneath thought, in the simple fact of being present without commentary. This presence does not explain itself, it simply is. In the desert stage, stillness confronts the habit of constant seeking. The impulse to improve, understand, or transcend begins to exhaust itself. Effort loses momentum because it no longer produces results. This can feel like stagnation, yet it is a necessary pause where the soul learns that truth is not reached through accumulation. By resting in stillness without trying to use it, awareness starts to recognize itself as the very ground it was searching for. This silent instruction reshapes perception. Instead of interpreting life through mental frameworks, there is a growing sensitivity to direct experience. Sounds, movements, and even inner sensations are met without judgment or analysis. The need to label fades, replaced by a simple attentiveness. In this attentiveness, a subtle guidance emerges not as commands or predictions, but as an intuitive sense of alignment. Actions arise naturally without struggle or justification. The desert teaches through absence rather than presence. By taking away familiar voices, it reveals a deeper listening. This listening does not seek meaning, it allows meaning to unfold on its own. What once felt like abandonment slowly reveals itself as intimacy, an intimacy with life unfiltered by ideas. In the quiet, awareness discovers that it was never meant to be guided by noise, but by the silent clarity that has always been here, waiting beneath the movement of thought. The collapse of meaning during the desert stage can feel more unsettling than emotional pain because it strikes at the very framework through which life has been understood. Ideas, beliefs, goals, and even spiritual interpretations that once gave coherence to experience begin to dissolve. The mind asks why it should continue when nothing seems to point toward a clear purpose. This loss of meaning is often mistaken for nihilism, yet it is not a rejection of life but a stripping away of borrowed significance. What is collapsing is not truth itself, but the mental structures that attempted to explain it. Meaning built by thought always depends on contrast, expectation, and narrative. It requires a past to justify it and a future to fulfill it. In the desert stage, these timelines weaken. The future no longer carries promises that inspire, and the past no longer offers identity or reassurance. Without these reference points, the mind experiences a void. This void is uncomfortable because thought cannot operate without meaning. Yet this discomfort signals that consciousness is no longer satisfied with second-hand understanding. As mental meaning falls apart, awareness is invited into immediacy. Life is no longer filtered through concepts of what it should be or what it represents. Experience becomes direct, simple, and unadorned. At first this simplicity feels flat or empty because the mind equates depth with interpretation. Over time, however, a different depth reveals itself, one that does not rely on explanation. Presence itself begins to feel complete, not because it answers questions, but because it no longer asks them. This stage prepares consciousness for direct knowing rather than conceptual knowledge. Knowing here is not accumulation of insight, but recognition. It is the recognition of being as self-evident, requiring no justification. When meaning collapses, awareness stands naked before life, without beliefs to shield it or goals to project onto it. In this nakedness, truth does not appear as an idea, but as a living sense of esness, quietly undeniable. The desert removes the need to make life meaningful and replaces it with the capacity to be intimate with life as it is. What once seemed empty reveals itself as open. Without imposed meaning, experience is no longer divided into success and failure, sacred and ordinary. There is a gentle clarity that arises not as certainty about life, but as peace with not knowing. This peace is not resignation, it is freedom from the burden of constantly having to explain existence in order to live it. In the desert stage, surrender emerges not as a practice or technique but as an inevitable way of being. Effort, striving and control, which once dominated thought and action, begin to lose their effectiveness. Life no longer responds to personal agendas, and the more the mind tries to force outcomes, the more it encounters resistance. This apparent failure of effort is unsettling because it undermines the familiar sense of agency, yet it is precisely here that the soul is invited to learn a new mode of engagement. Surrender does not mean passivity or indifference, it means releasing the insistence on shaping reality according to personal desire and allowing life to unfold from a deeper intelligence. At first, surrender feels like a loss. Plans, ambitions, and even spiritual practices may seem fruitless, and the mind resists this vacuum with anxiety or restlessness. Yet the desert stage shows that when striving ceases, the true source of energy is revealed. In the absence of personal will, life moves with a natural intelligence that was always present but previously obscured by mental effort. This intelligence does not require explanation or control, it simply expresses through being, in ways that are subtle, precise, and perfectly aligned with what is necessary. As surrender deepens, a profound shift occurs. The ego, which constantly seeks to direct, achieve, or understand, relaxes its hold. The sense of needing to fix, manipulate, or measure experience fades. In this quiet, there is a growing recognition that life itself is sufficient and that true guidance emerges when the self steps aside. Actions begin to arise spontaneously, without premeditation, judgment, or attachment to outcomes. There is a harmony between inner stillness and outer movement, a flow that cannot be forced but can only be trusted. Surrender also transforms perception of challenges and discomfort. What once felt like struggle is now seen as invitation. Resistance softens because it is no longer necessary to defend a rigid sense of control. The soul learns to move with life rather than against it. In this space, the desert is no longer barren but fertile. By relinquishing effort and allowing presence to guide, consciousness discovers a stability, freedom, and vitality that effort alone could never achieve. The emptiness becomes a canvas on which the subtle intelligence of life paints its expression, revealing that surrender is not the absence of action, but the presence of alignment. What feels like loss during the desert stage is often the unveiling of something far deeper and more enduring than anything the mind could previously imagine. The disappearance of familiar comforts, identities, and assurances creates a sense of emptiness, yet this very emptiness is a doorway into the formless presence that underlies all life. What the individual once sought in objects, relationships, achievements, or spiritual practices is now shown to exist already within, untouched by circumstance. The soul is being guided to recognize that the essence of being is not dependent on form, and that the apparent loss is simply the lifting of the veil that obscured this truth. In this stage, the ordinary markers of meaning fade, leaving a subtle awareness of presence itself. The mind struggles because it measures value through acquisition and experience, yet presence cannot be acquired, it is already here. Life may appear barren, yet the inner landscape begins to reveal an openness that was previously unnoticed. This openness is not a temporary relief or emotional comfort, it is a stable, silent ground that supports all things without needing to define or control them. What is revealed is a freedom beyond condition, a sense of being that cannot be diminished by any external circumstance. The experience of loss also dissolves attachment. Desires, expectations, and judgments gradually loosen as consciousness discovers that fulfillment does not reside in forms. This does not mean that life becomes inactive or dull. Rather, actions continue with clarity and ease, no longer driven by compulsion or fear of lack. There is a growing trust in the intelligence of life, a recognition that what is essential cannot be lost and is already complete within the present moment. This awareness carries a quiet strength, one that is unshakable by the vicissitudes of outer life. Through the desert stage, what once seemed like emptiness transforms into spaciousness. The absence of old securities allows a direct encounter with the living presence beneath all forms. In this space, the soul experiences a profound intimacy with life itself, a connection that transcends longing, striving, or explanation. Loss is revealed as an invitation to know the formless source that underlies all experience, a presence that is ever present and unchanging, quietly sustaining consciousness beyond the fluctuations of the mind and the world. The journey through the desert stage of awakening is often misunderstood as emptiness, loss, or failure, yet it is one of the most vital phases of inner transformation. Every sense of loss, every moment of silence, every collapse of familiar meaning serves a purpose to strip away dependence on outer forms, to quiet the mind and to reveal the deeper, formless presence that has always been the source of life. What feels like emptiness is in truth a clearing, a sacred space where consciousness can stand free of definition, where surrender replaces striving, and where true awareness awakens. The desert does not withhold, it teaches. It removes illusions, not life itself, and guides the soul to a direct recognition of being that is not shaped by circumstance, identity, or achievement. In embracing this stage, the seeming barrenness transforms into fertile ground, where presence, stillness, and inner knowing emerge as the truest fulfillment. The emptiness is not the end but the doorway, and beyond it lies the freedom, peace, and clarity that can never be taken away.